Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular kind of story that history produces only rarely, one that has everything. A story with holy war and financial genius, with castles on cliffs above the sea and dungeons below ground, with warrior monks who took vows of poverty and somehow ended up owning half of Europe, with a king who destroyed them out of greed and a pope who let it happen out of fear, and with a set of mysteries that 700 years of scholarship and 10,000 amateur conspiracy theorists have never quite managed to put to rest. Tonight we're going to tell that story, the story of the Knights Templar, an institution born on the streets of Jerusalem in the aftermath of the First Crusade, grown into something so powerful and so strange that the medieval world could not quite decide whether it was a gift from God or a threat to everything it had built, and destroyed in a single Friday morning in October 1307 in one of the most audacious acts of state violence in the history of medieval Europe. This story has almost everything you could want from a night like this. It will take a while to tell it properly, and I intend to tell it properly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here, and I mean that. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. There is something quietly comforting about knowing that this story is drifting over different latitudes and time zones simultaneously, settling gently over people who will never meet but are here tonight for the same reason. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. Maybe turn on a fan for that low background hum. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere else to be, and let us go back, all the way back to the road to Jerusalem. To understand why the Knights Templar existed, you have to understand what the First Crusade left behind. Not the Crusade itself, which was one of the most extraordinary military adventures the medieval world ever produced, but the problem it created on the morning after the victory. In July 1099, after 3 years of marching, starving, besieging and dying across thousands of miles of territory, the armies of the First Crusade breached the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants that contemporary sources describe with a combination of horror and theological satisfaction that tells you a great deal about the mental world of the people who committed it. The streets ran with blood. The Crusaders wept for joy. They believed, most of them sincerely, that they had accomplished the will of God. Then the leaders looked at each other and tried to figure out what to do with what they had won. The answer they arrived at was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a feudal state established in the heart of the Levant, ringed by enemies on every side, populated by a tiny Latin Christian ruling class governing a vastly larger Muslim, Jewish and Eastern Christian population, and dependent for its survival on a steady supply of soldiers, money, and political will from Western Europe. The supply was always uncertain. Crusaders came in waves, spent months or years in the Holy Land, and then went home. The permanent military establishment of the Crusader states was chronically understaffed. The roads that pilgrims travelled from the coastal ports to the holy sites of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth ran through territory that was neither fully controlled by the Crusader forces nor safe from the bandits and remnant Muslim forces who preyed on travellers. In the years immediately following the First Crusade, the roads to Jerusalem were dangerous enough that organised pilgrim travel was effectively impossible for people without substantial armed escort. It was into this specific problem, the gap between the aspiration of Christian pilgrimage and the lethal reality of the roads, that a French knight named Hugh de Payne rode in approximately 1119. Hugh was from the Champagne region of France, a minor nobleman of no great wealth or political standing, a veteran of the crusading campaigns, a man who had seen the Holy Land and decided to stay. His idea was simple in concept and audacious in practice. He would gather a small group of knights who would take monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, and dedicate themselves to a military rather than a contemplative vocation. They would not pray in cloisters. They would patrol the roads, They would escort pilgrims. They would fill the gap that the chronic shortage of military manpower in the Kingdom of Jerusalem had left wide open. He approached Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem, with this proposal. Baldwin gave them quarters. The quarters he gave them were housed in what the Crusaders believed was the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, a tradition that almost certainly confused the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which stood on the Temple Mount with the mythical structure that the Bible described. The location gave the new order its name. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would call them the Knights Templar. The temple would follow them everywhere they went, through their history and long after it ended. For the first 9 years of their existence, the Templars were genuinely poor. Hugh de Payne and the small group of knights who joined him, among them Godfrey de Saint-Omer, whose importance to the order's early days is attested in several sources, and perhaps 7 or 8 others whose names and numbers the early records record inconsistently, lived on charity and the occasional donations of pious nobles who admired their dedication. They kept their horses in the stables beneath the Temple Mount and patrolled the roads with the seriousness of men who had embraced an ideal at genuine personal cost. The seal they adopted showed 2 knights riding a single horse, an image that has puzzled and fascinated interpreters ever since, some reading it as a literal representation of their poverty, unable to afford separate mounts, others as a symbolic statement about brotherhood and shared purpose, others as something more deliberately mysterious. The Templars themselves never explained it, which is characteristic of an institution that understood quite early the political value of controlled ambiguity. The transformation from small band of road-patrolling knights to one of the most powerful institutions in the medieval world required a catalyst. The catalyst arrived in the form of Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was the most influential religious figure in early 12th century Europe, the abbot of the Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux in Burgundy, a man of extraordinary rhetorical power, ferocious personal discipline, and an absolute certainty about the will of God that he brought to every theological and political controversy he touched. He believed in the Crusades, he believed in monastic reform. And when Hugh de Paynes came to him in 1127, seeking the Church's formal endorsement of his new institution, Bernard recognised something in the Templar idea that fitted his own theology with unusual precision. The problem that bothered careful Christian thinkers about military violence, the obvious tension between the commandment not to kill and the practical necessity of maintaining order and defending the innocent, had never been entirely resolved by the just war tradition that Augustine and his successors had developed. Bernard's solution, articulated in a treatise he wrote for the Templars called De Laude Novae Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, was both theologically subtle and practically convenient. The ordinary knight, Bernard argued, was a man who risked his soul every time he fought, because his violence served human pride and ambition rather than God. The Templar knight was different. He had surrendered his own will entirely through his monastic vows. He killed without anger, without pride, without any personal stake in the outcome. He was, in Bernard's formulation, a malicide rather than a homicide, a killer of evil rather than a killer of men. The Templar who died in battle was a martyr. The Templar who killed was a minister of God's justice. It was an elegant solution. Whether it was a good one is a different question that Bernard did not particularly invite. In 1129, the Council of Troyes gave the Templars formal recognition as a religious order and provided them with a rule, the Latin rule, later expanded, that governed every aspect of their daily life. The rule specified their dress, the white mantle that distinguished full brother knights, with the red cross added after 1147. It governed when they ate, what they ate, how they prayed, how they managed their horses, how disputes between members were to be resolved, and the precise conditions under which a brother could be expelled from the order. It was a document that combined the spiritual rigour of Cistercian monasticism with the practical requirements of a military institution operating in the field. Sergeants, non-noble members who served in a military or administrative capacity, wore black or brown rather than white. Chaplains handled the liturgical and sacramental life of the order's communities. Craftsmen and servants rounded out the institutional establishment. The Templars were not merely a band of knights. From early in their existence, they were a complex organisation with differentiated roles, a clear hierarchy, and the institutional habits that sustain large enterprises across generations. Bernard's endorsement and the Council of Troyes' formal recognition opened the floodgates. Donations poured in from across Europe. Wealthy nobles who could not themselves crusade, or who felt the weight of unchosen sins pressing on their consciences, gave land, farms, mills, vineyards, towns, and money to an order that offered in return the spiritual association of holy warriors whose prayers and military service would benefit their donors' souls. The theological logic was familiar from the broader monastic tradition. Supporting a monastery's prayers was a recognised form of piety that had been generating donations for centuries, but the Templar version carried an extra charge. These were not only prayers, they were fighters. They were killing and dying for the Holy Land in your name, which added a dimension of vicarious participation in the crusading ideal that donors found genuinely compelling. Within a generation of Troyes, the Templars had accumulated a network of properties across France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and the Holy Land that would eventually number in the hundreds. These properties, called commanderies or preceptories depending on the region, were not merely dormitories for knights. They were economic enterprises, farms, mills, and workshops that produced income, recruited new members, trained horses and men, and channeled material support toward the crusading effort in the East. The Templar network was, from its early decades, precisely what its founders had implicitly designed: a logistical system for sustaining military operations in the Holy Land from a base of European economic resources. The genius of the design was that it worked in both directions. European properties funded Eastern operations, and the prestige of Eastern military service motivated the donations that sustained European properties. The two ends of the system fed each other. The Templars also received privileges from successive popes that placed them outside the ordinary structures of ecclesiastical authority in ways that made their economic operations more efficient and that generated enormous resentment among the bishops and secular clergy who found themselves unable to tax or discipline an institution operating freely in their territories. By the mid-12th century, the Templars were exempt from paying tithes on their own lands, exempt from the jurisdiction of local bishops, answerable only to the Pope, and permitted to build their own chapels and have their own chaplains, meaning they could conduct all the spiritual functions of the Church internally without depending on or paying the local ecclesiastical establishment. These privileges accumulated gradually through successive papal grants, each individually justifiable on the grounds of supporting the crusading effort, but collectively amounting to a position of institutional independence that no other entity in Christendom except the papacy itself enjoyed. The bishops hated it. The secular clergy hated it. Even some of the other military orders, the Hospitallers above all, found the Templars' accumulated exemptions deeply irritating. The Templars accepted the resentment as the price of effectiveness and continued expanding. To understand what being a Templar actually meant in practice, what the days looked like, what the rhythms of the institution felt like from inside, you have to read the rule. Not the Latin rule of 1129, which was relatively spare and dealt primarily with the grand organisational principles, but the later French retraits, the detailed statutes that accumulated across the 12th and 13th centuries, and that governed behaviour with the obsessive specificity that all functional monastic rules eventually develop. The retraits covered everything. They specified what a brother was to do when he woke before matins and could not sleep. He was to say prayers quietly in his bed, not disturb his companions, and think about nothing that would excite sinful thoughts, the rule adding this last instruction with the weary practicality of an organisation that understood very well the nature of men who had taken vows of chastity. They specified that brothers were not to beat their horses excessively, a prohibition that suggests either genuine concern for the animals or experience with brothers who took out their institutional frustrations in ways that required explicit prohibition. They specified the precise circumstances under which a brother could lock the door of his room. Essentially never, because locked doors suggested the kind of private activity that a community under monastic vows needed to remain transparent about. They specified what to do if a lion attacked the herd you were guarding. Call for help, and if no help came, retreat in good order, because the rule did not require a brother to die for livestock, only for the faith. The daily schedule was structured around the canonical hours, the 7 fixed prayer times that organised monastic life across all of medieval Christendom. The Templars prayed at matins in the small hours of the morning, again at prime at dawn, at terce, sext, none, vespers and compline through the day and into the evening. The prayer schedule was modified in the field. You could not observe every canonical hour on the march or during a siege, but in the preceptories of Europe and the garrisons of the Holy Land, the liturgical rhythm structured the day as it did in every other religious house. Between prayer times, brothers trained, the horses exercised, the knights practiced the physical maintenance of cavalry warfare, the sergeants maintained equipment and managed the preceptory's practical operations. Meals were taken together in silence while a reader read from Scripture or from the rule itself, a practice that was simultaneously spiritually edifying and practically useful in reminding the brothers of the regulations they were obligated to follow. The hierarchy of the order below the Grand Master was elaborate and carefully specified. The seneschal was second in command. The marshal commanded the military operations and managed the horses, equipment and military personnel. The marshal's position was the central executive role in any military situation. The commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem managed the order's properties and finances in the Holy Land. The draper managed clothing and equipment distribution. Each major territory had its own master and its own administrative hierarchy. The internal communication of the order, the regular dispatches between the Grand Master in the East and the masters in France, England, Iberia and Italy, was conducted by messenger service that was probably the most reliable private communication network in the medieval world, maintained by the order's own resources rather than depending on royal courier systems or ecclesiastical messengers. The reception ceremony, the ceremony by which new brothers were admitted to the order, was conducted in private, witnessed only by existing Templars, and this privacy was itself one of the things that made the order suspicious in the eyes of outsiders. The rule required that the ceremony be conducted away from public view, partly because the ritual involved the new brother being asked to confirm his freedom from prior commitments, his freedom from debt, his freedom from other religious vows, questions whose answers required a degree of candour that a public setting would discourage. But the privacy inevitably generated speculation, and it was that speculation. What do they do in there that they will not let the rest of us see? That provided the raw material for the accusations of 1,307 more than any documented reality. What actually happened in the ceremony, based on the portions of the rule that described it, was a liturgical and procedural affair that combined monastic profession with military induction. The candidate was asked the required questions about his personal status. He was warned about the severity of the life he was choosing, the rules specifying with some emphasis that the order's brothers slept on hard beds, ate poor food, wore rough cloth, and faced death regularly, a description that was accurate rather than rhetorically exaggerated. He was asked to confirm his understanding that the order's poverty, chastity, and obedience were genuine conditions of membership rather than symbolic gestures. He was invested with the white mantle. He was welcomed into the community with the kiss of brotherhood. The ceremony was then closed, with the rule specifying that nothing discussed within it was to be repeated outside. It was this last provision, confidentiality about a ceremony that outsiders could not attend, that metastasized under Philip's inquisitors into claims of obscene kisses and ritual denial of Christ. The Templars' relationship with the Islamic world in the Holy Land was far more complex and far more interesting than the straightforward enmity of crusading ideology suggested. 2 centuries of coexistence, warfare, negotiation, and trade in the Levant produced a Byzantine web of relationships that defied simple categorization. Templar commanders negotiated truces with Muslim rulers when the military situation made fighting unwise. Templar diplomats conducted the sophisticated back-channel communications that the Crusader states needed to survive in a region where their political position was always precarious. Individual Templars learned Arabic, which was operationally necessary for anyone managing relationships on the frontier, and for gathering the intelligence that kept garrisons alive in contested territory. The Templar fortress of Bagras in the Amarnis Mountains maintained relationships with the local Armenian Christian population and the adjacent Muslim territories simultaneously, a miniature of the broader diplomatic environment in which the order operated. The Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili branch of Shia Islam, whose mountainous strongholds in Syria and Persia made them a significant independent power in the Levant, had a particularly interesting relationship with the Templars. The Assassins at various points paid tribute to the Templars for their properties in the mountains near Templar-controlled territory, a protection arrangement that acknowledged the order's local power without implying broader submission. There were diplomatic exchanges, rumours of theological discussions, and at least one celebrated occasion when an assassin envoy arrived at the court of the King of Jerusalem with what appeared to be a genuine proposal of conversion to Christianity, an offer that was interrupted, according to the Chronicle of William of Tyre, by a Templar knight who murdered the envoy on the road, apparently in the belief that the conversion would be diplomatically inconvenient for the order's existing tribute arrangements. Whether the story is true in detail is uncertain. That it was believed, and believed to be characteristic of Templar institutional behaviour when institutional interests conflicted with the broader Crusader project, is itself historically significant. The first decades of Templar military activity in the Holy Land established the pattern that would characterise their operations for nearly 2 centuries. They took on the tasks that the Kingdom of Jerusalem's chronically undermanned military establishment could not reliably perform, garrisoning castles on the frontiers, patrolling the roads, providing the disciplined heavy cavalry that pitched battles required, and serving as a permanent professional corps around which the Crusader forces assembled when major campaigns were organised. Their performance in the field was, by the standards of the time, excellent. Templar knights were trained to hold their formation under fire, to wait for the order to charge rather than breaking discipline when the battle excitement took them, and to fight to the death rather than surrender, a discipline that made them terrifying opponents, and occasionally, as we will see, suicidally inflexible commanders. The castles they garrisoned and built across the Crusader states were among the finest military architecture of the medieval world. Chateau Pèlerin, also known as Atli, constructed on a promontory on the Palestinian coast after 1218, was built to a standard of defensive engineering that incorporated the most advanced thinking of its era. Massive concentric walls, towers projecting far enough from the walls to allow flanking fire along the entire face of each defensive line, a water-filled moat on the landward side, and a position on the sea that meant the garrison could be supplied by ship even during a complete landward siege. It was never taken by assault. When the Templars abandoned it in 1291 following the fall of Acre, they did so voluntarily, the last piece of Latin territory in mainland Palestine evacuated in good order rather than lost in battle. The castle still stands in partial ruin on the Israeli coast near the modern city of Atlit, its enormous stones as heavy and permanent as the day they were placed. The Templar fighting rule, the retraits, the detailed regulations governing military conduct, specified with considerable precision how knights were to behave in combat. They were not to break formation without explicit command from the marshal. They were not to charge or retreat without orders. If the Templar banner, the black and white beauséant that served as the order's battle standard, was still flying, every Templar in the field was obligated to rally to it regardless of personal danger. If the beauséant fell, they were to rally to the nearest Crusader standard. only if every Crusader banner on the field had fallen were individual Templars permitted to use personal judgment about withdrawal. The effect of these rules was to create a unit that anchored the formation of any army it fought alongside, refusing to break even under conditions that would have caused ordinary feudal cavalry to scatter. The effect was also to create a unit that suffered catastrophic losses when the battle turned against it, because the rules of the retreats made organised withdrawal very difficult in practice. At the Battle of La Forbée in 1244, the Templars lost approximately 300 knights in a single engagement, a number that represented a significant fraction of the Order's total military strength at any given time. They refilled the ranks and continued. The evolution of the Templars from warrior monks into something more complex began with a practical problem. Moving large sums of money from Europe to the Holy Land was one of the most dangerous and logistically challenging aspects of the crusading enterprise. Gold and silver were heavy, conspicuous, and attractive to robbers at every point on the long journey from France or England to the coast of Palestine. A pilgrim or crusader who converted his assets to coin before leaving home faced the constant risk of losing everything to thieves, shipwreck, or simple misfortune along the way. The Templars, who had preceptories across Europe and a major establishment in Jerusalem, found themselves in a position to offer a solution that was both practically elegant and financially revolutionary. The mechanism worked something like this. A pilgrim or crusader arriving at a Templar preceptory in France could deposit a sum of money and receive in exchange a document, a letter of credit, that could be presented at a Templar house in the Holy Land and redeemed for the equivalent value, minus a service fee. The money itself never needed to travel. What travelled was the document, and documents were far easier to carry, to hide and to protect than bags of coin. The Templars were not, it should be said, the inventors of the basic concept. Islamic merchants had been using similar instruments, the suftaja, in their commercial networks for centuries, and the Templars almost certainly developed their system partly in response to, and partly in imitation of, instruments they encountered in the Levantine trade world. But in the context of medieval Western European finance, which was still largely operating on the assumption that wealth meant physical possession of coin, the Templar letter of credit was genuinely transformative. It was also enormously profitable. The service fees accumulated across thousands of transactions into revenues that significantly supplemented the donations and agricultural income from the Order's European properties. The Templars also made loans, both to individual crusaders who needed immediate cash and to rulers who needed large sums for military or political purposes. The interest on these loans was technically disguised. The Church's prohibition on usury meant that lending at explicit interest was a sin, and the Templars were a religious order that could not be seen to be sinning as a matter of policy. But the disguise was fairly thin, and everyone, including the papal chancellery, understood the practical reality. The Templars lent money. They charged for the service. They called it by different names. The borrowers paid. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had evolved into something that a modern observer would recognise as a primitive but functional bank. They held deposits. They issued letters of credit. They made loans. They transferred funds across long distances. They managed the financial affairs of individuals and institutions too busy or too unsophisticated to manage their own accounts. The English crown used the London Temple, the Templar headquarters in England, which stood near the Thames in what is today the area around Temple Bar and the Inns of Court, as a secure storage facility for the royal treasure and as a clearinghouse for government financial transactions. The French monarchy had an equally close relationship with the Paris Temple. King Louis VII of France effectively used the Templar treasurer in Paris as his finance minister, a relationship of institutional dependence between the French crown and the Templar order that would eventually contribute to the catastrophe of 1307 in ways that neither party could fully anticipate in the 12th century. The Hospitallers, the other great military order of the crusading period, watched the Templars' financial development with a mixture of admiration and competitive irritation. The Hospitallers had been established even before the Templars, originally as a hospital organisation caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem before taking on military functions in the 1130s and 1140s. They had their own network of European properties, their own papal privileges, their own military establishment in the Holy Land. The two orders were frequently rivals, occasionally at open enmity, and yet also capable of coordinating effectively in the field when the military situation required it. The dynamic between them, competitive, suspicious, but ultimately bound together by the common project of defending the Crusader states, was one of the persistent features of Crusader politics throughout the 12th century. The political role that the Templars played in the Kingdom of Jerusalem was substantial and not entirely comfortable for the kingdom's rulers. The Templars were loyal to the Pope, not to the King of Jerusalem. They received their own financial revenues independently of the crown. They garrisoned castles that the kingdom could not afford to garrison itself, which meant the kingdom was dependent on them in ways that limited the king's effective authority over his own frontiers. Templar Grand Masters sat in the king's council and provided counsel that was sometimes accepted and sometimes resisted, with the tension that always exists between an institution that funds itself and an institution that depends on others' willingness to fund it. When Templar Grand Masters and Crusader kings disagreed, as they did over military strategy, over truces with Muslim rulers, over the management of the kingdom's desperate diplomatic situation, the disagreements played out in a context where neither side had clean authority over the other. The Crusader state's fundamental vulnerability was political as much as military. The Muslim world surrounding them was divided, and that division had been exploited with considerable skill throughout the 12th century by Crusader diplomats and commanders who understood that their best hope of survival lay in playing their opponents against each other. When Saladin united Egypt and Syria under a single ruler in the 1170s, he removed the condition that had made the Crusader state's survival possible. A unified Muslim state on the kingdom's two most important fronts, Egypt to the south, Syria to the north, with a ruler of Saladin's military and political quality, was an entirely different kind of problem than anything the Crusader states had faced before. The catastrophe came in the summer of 1187, and it came partly from a failure of the discipline that the Templars were supposed to embody. The story of the Battle of Hattin is one of the most dramatic in crusading history, a tale of military overconfidence, political rivalry, and the particular kind of disaster that results when an army allows its enemy to choose the terrain, the timing, and the conditions of engagement. Kingi of Jerusalem, a weak ruler whose claim to the throne was contested, made the decision to march his army toward Tiberias to relieve a siege that Saladin had deliberately set as bait, drawing the Crusader force away from water and toward open ground where his own cavalry could maneuver freely. The Templar Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort, who had a personal history of poor military judgment and a political stake in supporting Guy's authority, reportedly encouraged the march. Other councillors, including Raymond III of Tripoli, who understood Saladin's strategy, counselled against it. Guy marched. Saladin surrounded the Crusader force in the waterless hills above the Sea of Galilee and held it in place through a hot July night, burning the dry scrub to add smoke to the army's thirst, picking off stragglers with light cavalry, preventing any breakthrough to the lake below. By the morning of July 4th, the Crusader army was held on the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin. The name comes from the Arabic, referring to the shape of the ridge, and fighting under conditions of thirst and exhaustion that made their tactical situation essentially hopeless. The infantry broke first, climbing the hill and refusing to come back down when the mounted knights tried to rally them. The cavalry charged repeatedly and was unable to break the encircling Muslim forces. The red tent that Saladin had pitched on the hill to observe the battle stayed standing, a sign his centre had not broken, through charge after charge. In the early afternoon, the Templars around King Guy made a final effort that came close enough to Saladin's tent to make him catch his son when the boy started to panic. Then it was over. The prisoners taken at Hattin included King Guy, the true cross that had been carried into battle as the Kingdom of Jerusalem's most sacred relic, and a large number of Templar and Hospitaller knights. Saladin's response to the ordinary noble prisoners was chivalrous in the contemporary understanding of the word. He released Guy, ransomed others, and treated most captives with the consideration that the code of warfare between Muslim and Christian rulers had developed over decades of interaction. The Templars and Hospitallers he handled differently. He had them all executed, offering each the choice of converting to Islam, a choice that none of them accepted, and then having them killed by the Sufi scholars and volunteers from his entourage who had asked for the honour. He explained the decision in terms that were consistent with his own strategic understanding. Ordinary knights could be ransomed and would return to their farms and their families. Templar and Hospitaller knights would be ransomed and returned to the battlefield. They were, in his assessment, professional killers of irrecoverable commitment. He was correct about that. He killed them accordingly. Jerusalem fell in October 1187, 3 months after Hattin. Saladin's entry into the city was conducted with a deliberate restraint that contrasted pointedly with the massacre of 1099. The Muslim population was protected. The Christian civilians were given 40 days to raise their ransoms. The churches were converted to mosques. The Templar headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, from which the order took its name, was reconsecrated for Islamic worship. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had effectively ceased to exist. A coastal strip of cities and ports remained in Crusader hands, the most important being the fortified city of Tyre, whose defence by Conrad of Montferrat prevented a complete collapse. But the political entity that the First Crusade had established was gone, and the question was whether it could be rebuilt. The Third Crusade, which brought Richard I of England to the Levant in 1191, answered that question partially. Richard's campaign was probably the most competent military operation the crusading movement ever produced. Disciplined, logistically sophisticated, and commanded by a general who understood the Levantine environment well enough to fight effectively in it. The Templars served as the backbone of the order of march on the famous coastal advance from Acre to Jaffa, walking in formation on the seaward side of the column where they could be resupplied by the fleet, absorbing arrow fire from Saladin's harassing cavalry without breaking discipline, waiting for the moment Richard had designated to turn and charge. At Arsuf, where the decisive engagement of the campaign took place, it was the Hospitaller knights at the rear of the column who eventually broke formation under unbearable provocation from the trailing Muslim cavalry, charging before the order was given. Richard, furious at the breach of discipline, adapted his tactics in real time and turned the unauthorized charge into a victory by supporting it with the main cavalry. Saladin withdrew. The coast to Jaffa was open. Jerusalem, which Richard reached twice within sight and withdrew from twice, because he judged the political situation insufficient to hold it even if taken, remained Muslim. A treaty gave Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites. The crusading states in the coastal cities survived, reduced and dependent. The Templars continued. The 13th century was the period of the Templars' greatest power and their most interesting contradictions. They were simultaneously the most professional military force in the Crusader states, and the organisation most likely to undermine a campaign by pursuing institutional interests that conflicted with the overall strategy. They were the most financially sophisticated institution in Western Christendom, and the one most consistently accused of putting financial calculation ahead of spiritual obligation. They were the most rigidly disciplined military order in the Levant, and the one whose Grand Masters most frequently made catastrophic, independent decisions without adequate consultation. Understanding these contradictions requires understanding what the order had become by the mid-13th century. The Templar Grand Master of the 13th century was one of the most powerful figures in the medieval world, commanding an institution with military forces across 2 continents, financial resources that exceeded those of most European kingdoms, and legal privileges that placed him outside the authority of every ruler except the Pope. The man who held this office was elected by a complex procedure designed to prevent any faction within the order from controlling the outcome. a procedure so cumbersome that it sometimes produced leaders acceptable to everyone precisely because they were strong enough to offend no one, which is not the same thing as being strong enough to lead effectively under pressure. The Grand Master served for life and could not be removed by any earthly authority except the Pope. His decisions on military and diplomatic matters were final within the order, subject to no appeal. He ran the most complex multinational organisation in the medieval West, with the institutional tools of a monastic community: meetings, deliberation, collective decision-making, in situations that often required the speed and clarity of military command. The resulting tensions between institutional process and operational necessity were a persistent feature of Templar governance throughout the 13th century. The Fifth Crusade, which attempted to attack Egypt as the strategic base of Muslim power in the region, provides a useful illustration of how these tensions played out. The campaign of 1218 to 1221 was tactically competent and strategically incoherent. The Crusader force captured the strategically vital city of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile in 1219 after a long siege, then sat in it for a year and a half while the Crusade leadership argued about whether to accept the extraordinary peace offer from the Egyptian Sultan, which included the return of Jerusalem itself in exchange for the Crusaders leaving Egypt. The papal legate Pelagius refused the offer, partly on theological grounds. Accepting terms from the enemy felt like compromise, and partly because he expected a new German crusade that would tip the balance of forces sufficiently to allow conquest rather than negotiation. The new German crusade did not materialize in time. The Crusaders marched on Cairo, found the Nile floods cutting off their advance, and were forced into a capitulation that cost them Damietta and gained them nothing. It was one of the most avoidable disasters in crusading history. The Templars participated throughout, serving in the fighting without being particularly responsible for the strategic decisions that wasted the campaign's gains. It was in the politics of the Crusader states rather than in pitched battle that the Templars' institutional behaviour was most consequential and most controversial. The orders, the Templars and Hospitallers above all, had become permanent fixtures in the political life of Outremer, which was the name Crusaders used for their collective eastern territories, meaning simply the land overseas. Their castles, their revenues, their military manpower, and their papal privileges made them de facto co-rulers of a kingdom whose nominal monarchs were usually distant, disputed, or both. The Templars consistently pursued what they understood as the long-term interests of the Crusader enterprise, which sometimes aligned with what the king wanted and sometimes did not. Their opposition to Frederick II during his crusade of 1228 to 1229 illustrates the problem with particular clarity. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, had been promising a crusade for over a decade while managing a complex political situation in Europe that kept delaying his departure. He finally arrived in the Holy Land under excommunication. He and the Pope were in the middle of a fierce political quarrel, which meant that technically a crusade led by an excommunicated man had no spiritual validity. He had spent years in diplomatic contact with the Egyptian Sultan al-Kamil, and he negotiated a treaty that returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast to Christian control for 10 years, along with a guarantee of safe conduct for Muslim access to their holy sites on the Temple Mount. By any rational strategic assessment, it was a remarkable achievement. The Holy City recovered without a battle. The Templars refused to cooperate with his campaign, operating in the field near him but not under his command, maintaining a studied distance that made their institutional hostility clear. The Patriarch of Jerusalem was furious at the treaty. Local Crusader nobles were divided. The compromised nature of the arrangement, Jerusalem recovered but the Temple Mount left in Muslim hands, Muslim access guaranteed, the city's defences left incomplete, struck many as insufficient, theologically contaminated by the excommunication, and strategically fragile. They were probably right about the strategic fragility. Jerusalem was lost again in 1244, permanently this time, without ever having been properly fortified. The failure of the Crusader states to maintain cohesive political governance in the 13th century was not primarily the Templars' fault. The fundamental problem was that Outremer was governed by a feudal aristocracy that had developed a remarkably sophisticated set of legal constraints on royal authority, the Assizes of Jerusalem, a body of customary law that gave the nobility extensive rights of resistance to royal decisions, and that had no reliable mechanism for resolving disputes between its major institutions when they disagreed about strategy. The Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Italian merchant communes, the local baronage, and the distant crowned heads who occasionally showed up with crusading armies all pursued their own interests with a competitive intensity that made coordinated response to external threats consistently difficult. That the Crusader states survived as long as they did under these conditions is in some ways more remarkable than their eventual fall. Louis IX of France, the king later canonised as Saint Louis, led 2 crusades and was as close to an ideal crusading king as the 13th century produced. He was personally brave, organisationally capable, genuinely pious without the theological pride that had destroyed the Fifth Crusade's diplomatic opportunities, and willing to spend enormous resources on a project he understood as a religious obligation. The Seventh Crusade of 1248 to 1254 was the best prepared and best funded crusading expedition since the First Crusade. The Templars supported it fully and fought in it with the professionalism the order had always brought to campaigns led by competent commanders. It failed anyway. Egypt proved too large, too well supplied, and too competently defended. Louis was captured at the Battle of Fariska in 1250, an extraordinary event, a crusading king of France taken prisoner in Egypt and ransomed at enormous cost. He spent years in the Holy Land afterward, supervising the fortification of the coastal cities before returning to France when family crisis demanded his presence. He tried again in 1270, died of disease outside Tunis before the campaign properly began, and was buried where he fell. The crusading impulse that he embodied better than almost any other medieval ruler died with him, not completely, but with a quality of conviction that subsequent crusades never quite recovered. The fall of Acre in 1291 was the event that finally and definitively ended the Latin presence in the Holy Land, and the Templars were in the thick of it until the very end. Acre was the last major Crusader city, the commercial and administrative capital of what remained of the Crusader states, a dense and prosperous port city where the various factions of Outremer, the military orders, the Italian communes, the local baronage, had spent the previous decades feuding with the same creative intensity they had brought to every political question in the region. When the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with his army in the spring of 1291, the city's defenders, including substantial Templar and Hospitaller forces, fought with genuine determination against overwhelming numbers. The walls held for several weeks. The breakthrough came when a section of the outer wall near the accursed tower gave way, and Mamluk forces poured through. The fighting in the streets was intense. William de Beaujeu, the Templar Grand Master, was killed during the defence, struck by an arrow or a javelin through a gap in his armour. As he fell, some of those around him reportedly thought he was retreating. He told them, with what the chronicle describes as calm, that he was not retreating because he was dead. The last stand of the Templars in Acre took place in their fortress, the Templar compound at the southwestern corner of the city on the sea. A group of survivors, including civilians who had taken refuge there, held out for 10 days after the rest of the city had fallen. The Mamluk commander eventually negotiated a surrender agreement with a small Templar garrison. When his soldiers entered the compound and began assaulting the women and boys inside, the Templars killed them. The negotiations collapsed. The Mamluks undermined the foundations of the tower housing the Templar garrison. It collapsed, killing everyone inside, Templar knights, Mamluk soldiers and civilians together. The Templars evacuated what they could by sea. The city was demolished. The Crusader states were over. The question that now faced the Templar order was both practical and existential. Their entire institutional identity had been organised around the defence of the Holy Land. They had taken vows to that purpose, built their organisational structure around it, justified their extraordinary privileges to successive popes on its basis. The Holy Land was gone. What were they for? The answer that Templar Grandmasters began working out in the years after Acre was twofold. First, Cyprus, where the Templars had their new headquarters, could serve as a base for future reconquest. Second, the Order's European properties and financial operations could be reorganised to support the sustained effort that genuine reconquest would require. The discussion of how to reorganise the military orders after the fall of Acre, whether to merge the Templars and Hospitallers into a single unified order, whether to reform their internal governance, whether to focus on Iberian crusading against the Moors of Spain rather than the distant and expensive enterprise of recovering Palestine, was a genuine and sophisticated strategic debate that occupied the papacy, the Order's leadership, and thoughtful observers across Europe for the decade and a half between Acre and the arrests of 1307. What the Templars were not doing, in any serious or systematic way, was the things they would be accused of doing. But we will come to the accusations. First we need to understand the man who made them. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, the epithet refers to his looks rather than his character, though the sources disagree on whether his character deserved any better name, was the most able and most ruthlessly calculating monarch of his generation. He had inherited a France that was already the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and spent his reign extending royal authority at the expense of every competing institution, the barons, the church, the papacy itself. His quarrel with Pope Boniface VIII, which escalated from a dispute about taxing the clergy into a confrontation so direct that Philip's agents arrested the Pope in his palace at Anagni in 1303, was the defining political event of his reign, and demonstrated both his willingness to act against the theoretical authority of the Church and his practical power to do so with impunity. Boniface died within a month of the arrest, broken by the humiliation. The papacy elected a French pope, Clement V, who moved the papal court to Avignon in southern France in 1309 and operated for the next several decades in a state of dependency on the French crown that later historians would call the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Philip's financial situation was, by the standards of his military ambitions, perpetually inadequate. He had expelled the Jews from France in 1306 and confiscated their assets, a brutal act of fiscal predation dressed in theological language. He had debased the currency repeatedly, earning the nickname the Counterfeiter King from those who suffered the consequences. He owed substantial debts to the Templars and to the Italian banking houses that had financed his wars. He needed money with an urgency that shaped every major decision of his reign. When he looked at the Templar Order, its enormous wealth, its network of properties across France, its treasury in the Paris Temple, its peculiar institutional independence that placed it outside royal taxation and royal justice, he saw a solution to a problem that had occupied his attention for years. What he needed was a pretext sufficient to justify the arrest of an entire religious order whose members had taken vows recognised by the Church and whose properties were technically the possessions of the papacy, rather than of any secular power. The pretext required was extraordinary, because the action contemplated was extraordinary. He found it, or constructed it, or received it from informers whose motives were mixed, depending on how you read the evidence, in accusations of heresy. The specific accusations were the following. The Templars, it was alleged, required new initiates during their reception ceremony to deny Christ 3 times, to spit on the cross, and to exchange obscene kisses with their brothers. They allegedly worshipped an idol called Baphomet, a word that has never been satisfactorily explained and that appears nowhere in any other contemporary source. They allegedly permitted and encouraged sodomy among the brothers. They allegedly had their chaplains omit the words of consecration from the Mass, making the Eucharist invalid. They allegedly absolved each other of sins through their officers, a power that belonged to ordained priests alone. The accusations, taken together, amounted to the claim that the most celebrated Christian military order in Europe was secretly a community of heretics and perverts whose outward piety concealed systematic apostasy. The origin of these specific accusations is genuinely murky, and this is not a place where historical certainty is available. Some scholars have argued that they were entirely fabricated by Philip's ministers, citing the lack of any credible independent evidence for any of the practices described, and pointing to the obvious financial motivation for the arrests. Others have argued that the reception ceremony did involve some elements of ritual transgression, a symbolic denial of Christ, perhaps, intended as a test of obedience or as a form of preparation for the possibility of forced apostasy under torture by enemies, that were misunderstood or deliberately distorted into evidence of genuine heresy. Still, others have pointed to the order's long contact with Islamic culture in the Levant, and argued that certain practices may have evolved in ways that were theologically unorthodox without being deliberately heretical. The honest summary of the current state of the scholarship is that we do not know and cannot know for certain, given the nature of the evidence available. What we can know is that the specific accusations as stated were almost certainly false in the form they were presented, that a great many of the confessions extracted were obtained under torture or the threat of torture, and that the process by which the Templars were tried and condemned was a judicial catastrophe by any reasonable standard. The financial system the Templars pioneered has left no physical monument, but its structural legacy is more pervasive than any castle wall. To understand what the Templar financial operation actually looked like at its height, say in the mid-13th century, when the Paris Temple was serving as the effective treasury of the French monarchy, you have to understand the material reality of medieval money. The predominant coins of the period were silver deniers in France, silver pennies in England, and gold bezants in the Levant, with a bewildering array of local currencies, different weights, different purity standards, and different exchange rates that varied by location and fluctuated with the supply of precious metals from various sources. A merchant or crusader trying to move wealth from London to Jerusalem faced not only the physical danger of transport, but the practical impossibility of carrying enough coin to fund a major operation. A chest of silver pennies sufficient to pay a medium-sized army for a month would have required a small wagon just for the coin, and an armed escort large enough to make the transport visible and therefore vulnerable. The letter of credit that allowed value to travel as a written document rather than physical metal was not merely convenient. In the context of medieval transport and security, it was a revolutionary solution to an otherwise intractable problem. The Templar treasury in Paris occupied a fortified tower in the north of the city, the Tour du Temple, which gave its name to the quarter of Le Marais that surrounded it, and which would serve as a prison for Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette 5 centuries after the order that built it had been dissolved. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the tower and its surrounding compound were the financial centre of the French kingdom. The royal treasury was kept there under Templar guard. The taxes collected by royal agents across France were deposited there before being allocated to royal expenditures. The Templar treasurer effectively managed the daily cash operations of the French state, dispersing money to royal officials, recording receipts and payments in accounts that were audited by the Grand Master. It was an extraordinary arrangement that made the French monarchy operationally dependent on the Templar institution in ways that Philip IV would have understood very clearly, as a vulnerability to be exploited once he decided the exploitation was worth the risk. The London Temple, whose round church still stands near the Thames, served a similar if less dominant function for the English crown. The Master of the Temple in England sat in Parliament, one of the ecclesiastical lords who participated in the governance of the realm. Royal treasure was deposited at the Temple. The order negotiated loans to English kings and managed the accounts of crusaders who needed their English assets converted into portable credit before departure. When Richard I was ransomed from his Austrian captivity in 1192, 150,000 marks of silver, the largest ransom in English medieval history, the Templars and Hospitallers played a central role in managing the collection and transfer of funds across the international network required to assemble and pay a sum of that magnitude. The experience demonstrated, in the most visible possible way, that there was exactly one institution in the Western world with the network, the credit, and the operational capacity to move that kind of money safely across European distances. It was the military order. The Templar preceptories that dotted the English countryside were, to the people who lived near them, a familiar and often useful part of the local landscape. The preceptory at Temple Brewer in Lincolnshire, the preceptory at Cressing Temple in Essex, the large establishment at Eagle in the same county. These were working agricultural enterprises managed by Templar sergeants and servants, producing wool, grain and livestock that fed the order's treasury and its members. Local people rented land from the Templars, used Templar mills, and sometimes deposited valuables with the local preceptory when they needed secure storage. The order's reputation for reliable custody of other people's property extended well below the level of royal clients. The Templars were, in most of England's farming counties, simply landowners of a particular kind, monastic in their habits, military in their identity, and present in the landscape in the way that any large institutional landowner is present, through the evidence of their management and the memory of their name in the place names that survive: Temple Meads in Bristol, Temple in London, Temple Cloud in Somerset, Templecombe in the same county, where a painted wooden panel discovered in the 20th century, showing a bearded face that some have interpreted as a Templar devotional image and others as a more conventional religious painting, briefly excited the mythology generators before being absorbed into the more measured analysis of art historians. Temple Fortune in the north of London. The order left its name across the English landscape in the way that only institutions with long tenure and extensive property can leave names, not in dramatic monuments, but in the ordinary words that people used for the places where they lived, names that outlasted the institution by 7 centuries and are still in everyday use. In France, the footprint was even larger. The order's properties in Champagne, in Normandy, in the south, the commanderies of the Langue of France that provided the largest single block of Templar resources anywhere in Europe, created a network of institutional presence that permeated the French agricultural economy from the mid-12th century to the arrests of 1307. The wine-growing regions of Burgundy included Templar estates. The grain-producing plains of the Beauce had Templar mills. The river crossings of the Loire had Templar-maintained infrastructure. None of this was dramatic in the way that crusading battles were dramatic, but it was the material foundation without which the crusading battles could not have been sustained, and it represented 2 centuries of careful institutional management that built an organisation far more robust than its origins. 9 knights in a stable under the Temple Mount would have suggested was possible. The Templar involvement in the broader European political world went beyond financial service. The order's houses served as diplomatic neutral ground, places where parties in political conflict could meet under the implicit protection of an institution that was technically allied with no secular power and that had a practical interest in maintaining relations with everyone. The Paris Temple hosted sensitive negotiations between the French crown and its opponents on multiple occasions. The London Temple was used for similar purposes in English politics. The Grand Master was regularly called upon to mediate disputes between Crusader factions and occasionally between European powers. The order's reputation for disciplined neutrality, making it useful as an intermediary even in conflicts far removed from the crusading theatre. This diplomatic utility brought the Templars into the company of every significant ruler in the medieval West, and into knowledge of the most sensitive political information of their era. They knew who was in debt to whom. They knew which alliances were genuine and which were diplomatic pretense. They knew the financial position of every major monarch who had used their services, which by the late 13th century meant virtually every major monarch in Europe. This knowledge was, from the perspective of someone like Philip IV, simultaneously an asset. The Templars' financial competence was genuinely useful and a threat. An institution that knew this much, that operated outside royal taxation and royal justice, that was answerable only to a pope who was increasingly dependent on French political support, was an institution whose continued existence required ongoing management. Philip managed it in the most decisive way available to him. Philip moved on October 13th, 1307. The date was a Friday, and the fact that the arrests happened on a Friday the 13th has passed into folk memory as the origin of that date's ill reputation, a claim that historians treat with justified scepticism, since the superstition about Friday the 13th appears to have no clear documented connection to the Templar arrests before the 19th century. But that reflects the event's place in the popular imagination. In the pre-dawn hours of that morning, sealed orders were opened simultaneously across France by royal officials who had been instructed to act immediately and simultaneously to prevent any Templar from escaping the net. The coordination required was remarkable. France had nothing like a national police force. The operation depended on royal officials in dozens of locations receiving and acting on identical instructions at the same moment, which in 13th century terms required the orders to have been distributed and held in secrecy for some period before the arrests. The operation succeeded. Nearly all of the Templars in France were arrested in a single morning. The prisoners were interrogated by royal and inquisitorial officials over the following weeks and months. Torture was authorized and used. The confessions extracted were numerous and in the context of inquisitorial procedure legally significant. Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master who had come to France for the planned funeral of Philip's sister-in-law and who had been staying as an honoured guest of the king in the Paris temple, confessed to the charges. Other senior officers confessed. Ordinary brothers confessed in enormous numbers. The confessions were not uniform. Different individuals described the practices differently, with variations that a careful reader could interpret either as the natural variation of genuine testimony or as the inconsistencies that result when a large number of people are inventing accounts under pressure. Philip, who had cannily moved before seeking papal authorization for the arrests, confronted Clement V with a fait accompli. The Pope was furious at the procedural violation. The Templars were under papal jurisdiction and could not be arrested by a secular monarch without papal authority, but was in no position to simply demand their release. He sent legates. He issued letters of protest. He suspended the inquisitorial proceedings. He issued instructions that the arrested Templars be transferred to papal custody. Philip ignored the instructions and continued the interrogations. The process that followed over the next 7 years was one of the most legally and theologically complex proceedings the medieval papacy had ever conducted, and it produced outcomes that satisfied no one involved. The individual experiences of the Templars caught in the net of Philip's arrests varied enormously, depending on where they were, what rank they held, and what choices they made in the interrogation rooms. Some brothers confessed quickly and completely, whether from conviction that the charges were partially true, from genuine psychological collapse under the threat of torture, or from a calculated assessment that cooperation offered the best chance of survival. Some confessed and then reclaimed their confessions with equal speed when the opportunity arose, producing the legal category of the relapsed heretic that the inquisitorial procedure treated as the most serious possible category of offender. Some died during the proceedings, not executed but dead from the conditions of imprisonment, which for elderly men held without adequate food or medical care across multiple years were lethal enough without requiring direct violence. The interrogation methods used were the standard toolkit of the medieval Inquisition, which had been developed over the preceding century for use against the Cathar heretics of southern France, and which was refined by the 13th century into a system of considerable sophistication. The first stage was psychological pressure, the confrontation with the charges, the list of names of brothers who had already confessed, the offer of mercy to those who cooperated. The second stage was the threat of torture, which the inquisitorial procedure required to be presented formally and specifically before being applied. The third stage was the application of the strappado, suspension by the wrists bound behind the back, a technique that could dislocate the shoulders and that produced acute pain without immediately visible injury, or other methods approved under canonical law. The fourth stage was the formal recording of the confession thus obtained, its reading back to the prisoner, and its attestation under seal. What makes the Templar trial confessions particularly difficult to evaluate is that a significant number of the brothers who confessed under these conditions maintained their confessions after the torture had ended, in formal proceedings before ecclesiastical commissions, when they were not under immediate duress. This is the detail that historians who argue the charges were entirely fabricated have the most difficulty explaining away. Psychological research on false confessions, a field that did not exist in the medieval period but that has developed considerable sophistication in the modern one, suggests that a significant proportion of people who make false confessions under severe duress subsequently maintain those confessions even after the immediate pressure is removed, partly from the disorientation that extended imprisonment produces, and partly from a kind of investment in the false account that makes retraction psychologically more difficult than continuation. The Templar case, viewed through this lens, is consistent with a process that produced large numbers of false confessions, maintained by people who had been psychologically broken by the interrogation process, rather than by people who were telling the truth about genuine institutional practices. The provincial councils that Pope Clement called to determine the fate of Templars in their respective regions produced wildly different outcomes, which is itself revealing. In the British Isles, where the arrests had been less complete and the inquisitorial process was conducted with less rigour, the commissions found essentially nothing of substance against the order. In Cyprus, where the Eastern Templars had gathered, the proceedings produced minimal confessions. In Iberia, the local ecclesiastical authorities conducted their own proceedings and arrived at conclusions sufficiently favourable to the order that the Aragonese and Portuguese crowns were able to reorganise the former Templars into successor institutions without breaking continuity. In France alone, where the arrests had been total, the inquisitorial process most rigorously applied, and the political pressure from the crown most intense, were the confessions numerous and severe enough to sustain the charges. The geographic pattern of the confessions maps almost perfectly onto the geographic pattern of French royal control. This is not evidence that is consistent with the charges being true. It is evidence that is consistent with the charges being fabricated and the confessions produced by force. The Council of Vienne in 1311 and 1312 was supposed to determine the fate of the order through a formal judicial process. The evidence was ambiguous. A significant number of Templars had retracted their confessions, explaining that they had been made under torture. Witnesses who appeared to defend the order were threatened with prosecution as relapsed heretics if they continued. The legal counsel who would have argued the order's case was prevented from appearing on the grounds that no individual could represent an institution in a proceeding about the institution itself without the institution's authorization, and the institution's leadership was imprisoned and could not authorize anyone. The council ended not with a judicial verdict of guilty, but with an administrative suppression of the order under the papal bull Vox in Excelso in March 1312. The Templars were not officially found guilty of the charges against them. They were suppressed on the grounds that the order's reputation had been so damaged by the proceedings that it could no longer function effectively. Most of their property was transferred to the Hospitallers. Philip received a portion as compensation for the costs of the arrests and imprisonment. The Grand Master and several senior officers were reserved for the papacy to sentence. Jacques de Molay had been in prison for nearly 7 years when he was brought before a commission in March 1314 to receive his sentence. He had confessed, retracted his confession, confessed again, retracted again. A cycle that reflected either genuine uncertainty about the order's guilt, strategic calculation about what confession would mean for the order's fate, or the psychological dissolution that 7 years of imprisonment following a lifetime of institutional certainty produces in a man of 70. When the commission read out the sentence of life imprisonment that Philip's advisers had arranged, something shifted in Molay. He stepped forward. He declared that the charges against the order were false. He declared that the confessions had been made under torture and were without validity. He declared that the order was pure and its rule holy. It was an act of retroactive courage, or perhaps simply of clarity that arrives when there is nothing left to lose, that redeemed something of what had been yielded during the long years of capitulation. The commission recessed to consider this unexpected recantation. It constituted, under inquisitorial law, a relapse into heresy. Having confessed and then withdrawn the confession while still being considered guilty, Moley had technically relapsed, and relapse meant one thing. That evening, on a small island in the Seine called the Île aux Juifs, Philip IV had Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, burned alive. Molay died slowly. The chronicles that describe the scene give him various final words, none of which can be verified and most of which reflect later tradition. The most famous of these, that he summoned Philip and Pope Clement V to appear before God within a year, became one of the most celebrated of the medieval period's deathbed curses. Whether he said it or not, the facts obliged. Clement V died within a month, Philip IV within a year. The coincidence was noted by everyone and explained by each according to their own theology. The Templar trial produced immediate practical consequences and long-term historical effects of very different kinds. The immediate practical consequences were, in most respects, relatively limited. The Hospitaller Order received a substantial portion of Templar property in France, England, and other countries. The transfer was not instantaneous or complete, and local rulers found numerous reasons to delay, dispute, and in many cases simply absorb property that had been intended for the Hospitallers. Philip kept more than he was supposed to. Other monarchs followed his example. The former Templars themselves were dispersed, not executed in any systematic way. The sentence of the Council of Vienne provided for pensions and accommodation in former Templar houses for the ordinary brothers, and faded into the general population of former religious over the following years. In Iberia, the situation was more complicated. The kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal, where the Templars had played a significant military role in the ongoing wars against Muslim Granada, and where the military order's tradition remained strategically essential, handled the suppression with varying degrees of reluctance. In Aragon, a new order, the Order of Montisa, was created specifically to absorb the former Templars and their property. In Portugal, the Templars were essentially reconstituted as the Order of Christ, maintaining their personnel, their properties, and most of their functions under a new name that avoided the taint of the French proceedings. The Order of Christ in Portugal is one of the more interesting institutional continuations in medieval history. It received the Templar properties and many of the former Templar personnel. It maintained the maritime and navigational expertise that the Templars had developed in their operations along the Iberian and Atlantic coasts. When the Portuguese crown began its systematic exploration of the African coast and the Atlantic islands in the 15th century, under Prince Henry the Navigator, himself a Grand Master of the Order of Christ, it was Templar-descended institutional knowledge, Templar-derived financial resources, and ships sailing under the Order of Christ's Cross, a version of the Templar Cross, that led the way. This is not myth-making about a secret continuation of the order. It is documented institutional history. The connection between the Knights Templar and the Portuguese Age of Discovery runs through the Order of Christ in a lineage that is clear and direct. In Scotland, where the Templar arrests had been less systematically prosecuted under a king at odds with the papacy, tradition holds that Templar refugees played a role at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert Bruce defeated the English forces of Edward II. The evidence for this is, to put it charitably, thin to the point of transparency. But the tradition reflects something real about how the Templars' fate was perceived in the peripheral regions of Christendom, as an injustice that deserves some corrective, some story in which the persecuted ultimately served a just cause. Whether they fought at Bannockburn is almost certainly legend. That the legend exists tells you something about how the trial and dissolution affected the medieval imagination. The long-term historical effects of the Templar story are more diffuse and more interesting than the immediate institutional consequences. The trial itself was a defining event in the history of the relationship between church and state, between papal authority and royal power, and between the institutional forms of crusading Christianity and the political realities of early modern monarchy. The precedent that Philip IV established, that a secular ruler with sufficient determination and a compliant pope could destroy an institution protected by the most powerful spiritual authority in the Western world, was not lost on subsequent rulers. The Avignon papacy that followed was partly a consequence of Philip's demonstrated willingness to use state power against the Church's institutional interests. The General Councils movement of the 14th and 15th centuries, which attempted to establish conciliar authority over papal decisions, was partly a response to the kind of papal royal collusion that had been demonstrated at the Council of Vienne. The questions the Templar trial raised about the proper limits of institutional power, about the conditions under which confession is reliable evidence, about the relationship between procedure and justice, these were questions that the subsequent centuries would not stop asking. The Templar legacy in the realm of popular culture, legend and conspiracy theory is a phenomenon that deserves some honest attention, not because the conspiracies are true, but because the persistence and creativity of the mythological tradition around the Templars tells us something genuine about what the historical order meant and continues to mean. The raw material that history provides is genuinely extraordinary. An organisation that combined military power, religious vocation, international finance, and political influence in a single institution. A dissolution so sudden and so violent that it left few survivors and fewer records intact. A trial so legally contaminated that the question of guilt or innocence was never clearly resolved. A set of charges that included an idol called Baphomet whose name was never explained, and a deathbed curse that appeared to come true within a year. You could not invent a more perfect generator of legend if you tried. History, which rarely cooperates with storytellers, here produced something that required almost no enhancement. The Templar legend began developing almost immediately after the dissolution. By the late medieval period, stories of hidden Templar treasure, of documents concealed before the arrests, of survivors who had escaped to carry on the order in secret, were already circulating in various forms. The founding mythology of Freemasonry, which developed in 17th and 18th century Scotland and England, drew on Templar imagery and claimed, in some of its forms, a lineage that ran back through the medieval order. This claim is historically unfounded. Modern Freemasonry appears to have originated in the guild traditions of Scottish stonemasons, with their elaborate initiation ceremonies and hierarchical degrees, not in any genuine continuity with the medieval Templars, but the symbolic connection was cultivated deliberately because the Templar story provided a mythology of ancient wisdom, secret knowledge, and persecuted virtue that served the purposes of Masonic identity. The Scottish Rite, one of Freemasonry's major branches, still includes Templar degrees. The Masonic connection then provided a further foundation for 19th and 20th century conspiracy theories that extended the Templar mythology in directions that would have astonished, and probably amused, Hugh de Paynes. The Baphomet has had a particularly energetic afterlife. The word appears in the trial records in various spellings, referred to by a handful of confessors as an object or figure venerated by the order. No two descriptions agree in detail. Some say it was a human head, some a skull, some a bearded figure on a wooden beam, some deny any such thing existed. Modern scholars have proposed various etymological origins for the name, an old French corruption of Mahomet, meaning Mohammed, which would make Baphomet an accusation that the Templars worshipped the Islamic prophet, which fits the polemical context of the trial accusations. A Gnostic or Kabbalistic term, a reverse transliteration of the Greek and Hebrew terms for wisdom, none of them conclusively proven. Eliphas Levi, a 19th century French occultist, drew Baphomet as a winged, hermaphroditic, goat-headed figure seated on a throne, and this image, reproduced in his 1856 book and endlessly copied since, is what most people today picture when they hear the word. It has no connection to anything described in the actual trial records. It is a 19th century invention that has been mistaken for a medieval reality with a persistence that would make Levis proud. The Holy Grail connection that various popular writers have attached to the Templars rests on no medieval evidence whatsoever. The Grail romances, the Arthurian cycle, Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, were being composed in the same 12th and 13th centuries when the Templars were active, and some scholars have proposed influences running in both directions, with Templar imagery seeping into Romance tradition, or Romance tradition shaping how certain Templar practices were understood. This is a legitimate area of literary and cultural history. The claim that the Templars were the actual guardians of an actual holy vessel, whether the cup of the Last Supper, the Ark of the Covenant, or some document that proved Jesus had descendants, is a modern construction with no medieval roots and no evidentiary support. The claims advanced in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, published in 1982, and in the fiction that fed off it, including the Da Vinci Code, are creative exercises that have been directly and specifically refuted by the documentary evidence available. This is not a case where historians are unsure. The specific claims made in those works were examined against the actual medieval sources and found to be inventions. The story of the actual Templars is strange and dramatic and sufficient unto itself. It does not need assistance from materials that have no basis in fact. What the Templar mythology represents, at its most honest level, is a persistent cultural need for the story to have continued, for the treasure to have been hidden, for the knowledge to have been preserved, for the order to have survived in some form and to be carrying on its work in secret. This need is psychologically comprehensible. The dissolution of the Templars was an act of state violence against an institution that had dedicated itself to a cause the medieval Christian world considered holy. The men who burned on the Île aux Juifs were, by most reasonable assessments, innocent of the charges that killed them. There is something in the human imagination that resists accepting that the story just ends there. With a corrupt king and a compliant pope and 70-year-old man dying slowly on an island in the Seine for refusing to maintain a lie. The mythology provides a continuation that history does not. The castles they built are still there, or most of them. The Tower of London has a temple tower. The Temple Church in London, one of the finest examples of Norman round church architecture in England, still stands near the Thames. Its nave a rotunda modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Its floor studded with the effigies of Templar knights in stone who have been lying there since the 12th and 13th centuries. In Paris, the Tour du Temple, where Jacques de Molay spent the last years of his life, and where the French royal family would later be imprisoned during the Revolution, was demolished in the early 19th century, but the name of the quarter still carries the memory. The Castelo dos Templarios in Tomar, Portugal, the great fortress and convent of the Templars in Iberia, rebuilt and expanded by the Order of Christ, stands in remarkable preservation and contains the extraordinary Manueline window, one of the finest examples of that ornate late Gothic style, covered in nautical imagery that connects the maritime heritage of the Order to the discoveries of the Portuguese explorers. The Château Pellerin at Atli still rises from its promontory above the Israeli coast, its massive stones unbroken, the greatest Templar fortress never taken by assault. The Iberian Peninsula was the theatre in which the Templars proved most immediately useful to rulers who had an ongoing military need for disciplined professional soldiers and who controlled enough territory and revenue to reward that service generously. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian military campaign to retake the peninsula from the Muslim kingdoms that had controlled most of it since the early 8th century, was, in its 12th and 13th century phase, a project that shared the ideological framework and much of the institutional infrastructure of the Holy Land Crusades. Pope Eugenius III, in the same Bull of 1145 that authorised the Second Crusade to the east, explicitly extended crusading status to the Iberian campaigns, and the Templars were early and significant participants. The Portuguese and Aragonese crowns granted the Templars substantial estates and strategic castles in exchange for military service, creating the network of Iberian preceptories that would eventually number among the order's most valuable properties. The Templars fought at the Siege of Tortosa in 1148, one of the crucial operations that extended Aragonese control along the Mediterranean coast. They garrisoned frontier castles in Portugal in the territories between the Christian north and the Muslim south, providing the permanent professional force that kept the border stable between the larger campaigns. Afonso I of Portugal gave the Templars the town of Sao in 1128, one of the earliest significant grants in the peninsula, and the relationship between the Portuguese crown and the Templars was sufficiently close and productive that it survived the order's dissolution elsewhere in a more direct form than anywhere else in Christendom. The Iberian Templar establishment had a character somewhat different from the Eastern one. The Holy Land was the order's spiritual purpose and its operational centre. Iberia was its most reliable source of institutional stability, a theatre where the military need was permanent rather than episodic, where the local rulers were consistent patrons rather than periodic visitors, and where the geography and political situation created conditions in which a professional military order with its own castles and revenues could function with a degree of autonomy that the fragmented Kingdom of Jerusalem, with its competing jurisdictions and chronic political instability, rarely provided. Brothers who served in Iberia had a different experience of the order's life than those who served in Acre or Tortosa in Syria, a frontier life certainly, but one with established routines and stable command structures rather than the constant improvisation of Crusader politics in the East. The Second Crusade of 1147 to 1149, which brought the Templars into their first major collaboration with a Western European king on crusade, was a catastrophic failure that illustrated several of the institutional tensions that would recur throughout the order's history. King Louis VII of France, who led the French contingent, placed his army under Templar direction for the march through Anatolia after the French forces had suffered badly from Turkish harassment during their own undisciplined advance. The arrangement worked for a time. The Templars' ability to maintain march discipline even under fire was exactly what the French army needed, but broke down at the Meander River when the vanguard advanced too far without maintaining formation and was caught by the Turks with heavy losses. The crusade reached Antioch and then Jerusalem, attempted a siege of Damascus that was abandoned under circumstances the sources describe differently, but that all agree were humiliating, and returned to Europe having accomplished essentially nothing. The political fallout included accusations that the Templars had been bribed by the Damascenes to abandon the siege, accusations that Louis appears to have credited, however briefly, before the practical implausibility of the charge and the lack of any concrete evidence discouraged further pursuit. The charge was almost certainly unfounded, but its appearance reflects a pattern that would recur in the complex and murky politics of Crusader diplomacy, where truces and negotiations with Muslim rulers were sometimes strategically essential and sometimes profoundly controversial. The Templars' willingness to engage in the pragmatic calculations that long-term presence in the Levant required made them vulnerable to accusations of corruption, or worse, by observers whose crusading ideology was more pure and whose understanding of the local situation was less complete. The gap between crusading idealism and Levantine reality was one of the persistent structural tensions of the movement, and the Templars inhabited that gap more fully than almost any other institution. The personalities that the order produced across 2 centuries are worth knowing individually, because institutions are ultimately made of people, and the Templar institution produced people of extraordinary variety. Robert de Craon, the second Grand Master who served from 1136 to 1149, was the man most responsible for building the institutional framework that the order's first decade had only sketched. The papal privileges that defined the Templars' unique position, the exemptions from local ecclesiastical authority, the right to retain a portion of the spoils of war, the freedom to conduct burial services for excommunicated persons who repented at the end, were accumulated largely under his grand mastership through a sustained effort of diplomatic cultivation at the Roman Curia that required both the personal connections and the institutional patience of a man who understood that lasting institutional power is built in chanceries as much as on battlefields. Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master from 1171 to 1179, represents a different type. The warrior Grand Master whose institutional judgment did not always keep pace with his personal courage. He captured Saladin in a night raid in 1179, a stunning tactical achievement that he then effectively surrendered by refusing to negotiate his own release when he was captured in a counter-engagement the same year, on the grounds that a Templar brother was forbidden to pay ransom and that his life belonged to God and the Order rather than to himself. He died in a Saladin prison, possibly of poor treatment, possibly of stubbornness, possibly of a combination of the two that was entirely characteristic of the institution he led. His refusal of ransom was, from the rule's perspective, entirely correct. From the perspective of an order that needed his experience and judgment on the deteriorating situation in the Holy Land, it was a considerable loss. William of Beaujeu, Grand Master from 1273 to 1291, was probably the most diplomatically sophisticated Grand Master the Order ever produced, and he presided over the institution during the decades of its final effort to maintain the Crusader states. He conducted negotiations with the Egyptian Sultan that were so close to a working accommodation that the Crusader barons who resented the pragmatism murdered his messenger and repudiated the arrangement he had been building. He organised the defence of Acre with the professionalism that his entire career had demonstrated. He died at the walls. He had understood better than most of his contemporaries what was coming, and had spent his Grand Mastership trying to prevent it with the diplomatic and military tools available to him. The tools were not sufficient. The story does not always reward the most capable participants. The Second Crusade also introduced to the historical record one of the most significant documents in the Order's early history, though it was not recognised as such at the time. The Templar master in Jerusalem, Everard de Bar, personally negotiated with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos to secure safe passage and provisions for Louis VII's army as it passed through Byzantine territory. The negotiation required de Bar to guarantee the behaviour of the French army with Templar credit and Templar resources, an unprecedented extension of the Order's institutional authority into the diplomacy of a major crusade. It demonstrated both the confidence that the Byzantine court placed in the Templars as a reliable counterparty, and the Order's own developing sense of itself as an entity, with independent diplomatic standing rather than merely a military adjunct to whatever crusading army was currently in the field. The financial system the Templars pioneered has left no physical monument, but its structural legacy is more pervasive than any castle wall. The mechanisms they developed for transferring value across distance without physically moving coin, the letter of credit, the deposit account, the institutional management of other people's money, were refined and extended by the Italian banking houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and later the Medici, who inherited the Mediterranean financial world in which the Templars had operated. The modern bank, in its basic functional logic, carries traces of the system that Hugh de Paynes's successors developed in the 12th century on the roads between Paris and Jerusalem. This is not a fanciful connection. It is a traceable institutional history, running through the documented practices of medieval banking from the Templars through the Italian houses to the first national banks of the 17th century. The Templars did not invent banking, but they demonstrated, on a scale and with an institutional sophistication that had no contemporary parallel, that it was possible to manage money across international distances as an organised system, rather than as a series of individual transactions. That demonstration was influential in ways that are still working themselves out. The question of what the Knights Templar actually were, beneath the mythology, beside the legend, at the level of the documented historical reality, is worth holding in your mind as the story settles around you. They were men who believed, with the sincerity of their time and the limitations of their time, that God wanted the Holy Land defended, and that they were the instrument of that defence, They were professionals who took pride in their competence and discipline, in a world where most military activity was the improvised product of feudal obligation rather than institutional training. They were administrators of considerable ability, who built and maintained a multinational organisation with no precedent in the world they inhabited. They were bankers who discovered the logic of credit and interest before the vocabulary for describing it was available. They were builders of castles so well engineered that some of them still stand 8 centuries after completion. They were participants in a brutal colonial enterprise that displaced and frequently massacred the people who lived in the lands they were defending, and that historical judgment on the crusading movement as a whole applies to them as fully as to anyone. They were men who died at the walls of Acre for a cause they had given their lives to, and men who died on an island in the Seine for refusing to accept a lie about themselves. The mystery that surrounds them is partly genuine. We cannot know everything about an institution that was destroyed rapidly and incompletely documented, and partly manufactured, the accumulation of 7 centuries of imagination, working on a story that genuinely does not have a fully satisfying ending. History does not always give us the endings we want. The Templars were destroyed. The man who destroyed them was Philip IV, who was motivated by debt and by a ruthless political calculation that proved correct in every immediate term. The institution that should have protected them, the papacy, bent to political pressure with a flexibility that Clement V perhaps considered wisdom, and that posterity has generally considered cowardice. The knights who had spent their adult lives learning to hold their formation under fire, to wait for the command, to rally to the banner when it was still flying, were helpless before a legal process conducted against them in a language they understood imperfectly, and by rules designed to produce a specific outcome. The Beausillon, the Templar battle standard, black above and white below, which some interpretations read as darkness vanquished by light, and others as the darkness and light of the Order's own dual nature, fell, in the end, not on a battlefield but in a courtroom. And the rule said that when the banner fell, you were to make your best judgment about how to proceed. Jacques de Molay made his, standing up in the morning of his last day and refusing the false account of the Order he had served for 50 years. Whether it was wisdom or courage or simply the clarity that arrives at the absolute end of things, it was the most purely Templar act of his entire time as Grand Master. He held his position, he refused to retreat, he died. It is worth pausing here, before the close, on what the Templars meant within the broader world of the military orders, because they did not exist in isolation, and placing them in that context clarifies both their distinctiveness and the institutional forces that ultimately destroyed them. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Order of Santiago, the Calatrava, the Alcantara, the proliferation of military orders in the 12th and 13th centuries was one of the most remarkable institutional developments of the medieval period, and the Templars were simultaneously the model that most of these orders followed and the most extreme expression of the ideal that they all embodied. The Teutonic Knights, founded in 1190 during the Siege of Acre as a hospital brotherhood, and militarised in the early 13th century, followed a trajectory that diverged sharply from the Templars at a crucial point. When the fall of the Holy Land deprived both orders of their primary theatre of operation, the Teutonic Knights pivoted with remarkable decisiveness toward the Baltic, where the Christianization of the pagan Prussian and Lithuanian peoples offered a crusading mission with geographic proximity to the Order's European base and the possibility of territorial acquisition that the exhausted Levantine enterprise no longer provided. By the late 13th century, the Teutonic Knights were governing a substantial territorial state in Prussia, and the Baltic, that would evolve into the Duchy of Prussia, and eventually into the kingdom whose capital was Königsberg. The Order's Grand Masters held court in the magnificent castle of Marienburg, which was, at the time of its construction, the largest brick castle in the world. The Teutonic Knights transitioned from a crusading order into a territorial power with a smoothness that the Templars, whose institutional identity was more purely and inflexibly defined by the Holy Land mission, were never able to replicate. The Hospitallers took a different path again. After the fall of Acre in 1291, they moved to Cyprus and then, in 1309, captured the island of Rhodes from its Byzantine rulers and established there a sovereign naval state that would defend the eastern Mediterranean against Turkish expansion for the next 2 centuries. The Knights of Rhodes, which is what the Hospitallers became known as during their tenure on the island, developed a naval tradition that was genuinely consequential for the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean, successfully resisting an Ottoman siege in 1480 before finally yielding the island to Suleiman the Magnificent in 1522 after a siege that lasted 6 months, and that even the victorious Suleiman reportedly described as one of the hardest military operations of his reign. The Hospitallers then moved to Malta, which Charles V gave them in 1530 and became the Knights of Malta, the name by which they are still known today. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta still exists as an international organisation recognised by the United Nations, about as complete an example of medieval institutional survival as the historical record provides. The contrast between the Hospitallers' survival and the Templars' destruction is instructive. The Hospitallers had been smarter or luckier in several decisive respects. They had avoided the concentration of property and financial operations in France that made the Templars a target of particular interest to the French crown. They had maintained their hospital function alongside their military one, which gave their institutional identity a dimension of unambiguous public service that made them considerably harder to attack on theological or moral grounds. They had, through the fortunate accident of circumstance, been less deeply entangled in the personal financial dependencies of individual monarchs. And after Acre they had found a new mission, naval defence of the Mediterranean, that was visibly useful to the Christian world in ways that the Templars, still debating strategy in Cyprus, had not yet convincingly articulated. The Hospitallers' story is not a story of greater virtue. It is a story of better institutional positioning and a degree of good fortune at moments when fortune mattered enormously. The question of what the crusading movement was, and what it meant to the people who participated in it, is one that the Templars force you to confront directly, because they were the institution most completely defined by that movement. The Templars participated in the crusading enterprise at its most committed and most professional level, which means they participated in an enterprise that, by any modern moral assessment, included significant amounts of religiously motivated massacre, colonial dispossession, and the systematic violence of a holy war ideology that most contemporary ethical frameworks would find deeply troubling. This is simply true, and does not require qualification. What is also true is that the Templars experienced the crusading enterprise from the inside, in ways that complicated and in many cases moderated the crusading ideology's most extreme implications. 2 centuries of fighting and living in the Holy Land produced men who had Muslim acquaintances and occasionally genuine friends, who spoke Arabic fluently, who had traded with and negotiated with and in some cases genuinely admired their opponents, and who understood the practical impossibility of the genocidal purism that crusading rhetoric sometimes suggested. The gap between the ideal and the reality was where the Templars actually lived, and it was a more complicated and more human place than either the crusading rhetoric or the modern critique quite captures. What the Templars were defending at the most immediate and concrete level was not an ideology or a theological proposition, but a set of places and people and communities that they had built their lives around. The brothers who died at Hattin and at Acre were dying for something real, for the city where they had prayed and trained and eaten and slept for years, for the roads they had patrolled in all seasons, for the communities of pilgrims and settlers whose safety had been their institutional purpose. The theological justification was the frame. The human content was something more ordinary and more genuine, the loyalty that professional soldiers develop to the place and the people they have spent their lives protecting. It is a loyalty recognisable across centuries and cultures, and it is not diminished by the circumstances of its origin. The night is quiet now, and the story has come to its end, or to that particular kind of ending that allows the imagination to continue a little further on its own, into the castles and the roads and the morning light in Jerusalem and the cold water of the Seine. 2 centuries of men who believed that the most important thing in the world was worth dying for, and who organised their entire lives around that belief with a thoroughness that no institution before or since has quite replicated in the same form. They were wrong about many things, in the way that people of any era are wrong about many things when measured against the moral understanding of a later time. They were right about one thing that their story demonstrates with a clarity that no amount of later mythology obscures, that what human beings build together, if they build it with enough conviction and enough discipline, can outlast the individuals who built it by centuries. The castles are still there. The financial logic is still operating. The cross is still on the window in Tamar. The effigies are still lying on the floor of the temple church, stone hands folded over stone swords, not going anywhere. Let that settle into the quiet around you now. The Bosphorus has gone dark and Jerusalem is sleeping, and the Seine moves past the island where the last Grand Master stood up and told the truth on the last morning of his life. The roads the Templars patrolled are roads now with different names carrying different traffic, but the roads are still there. The land is still there. History keeps going, which is either the most comforting or the most unsettling thing about it, depending on the night. Rest easy.